Well, friends and comrades, I am going to start the meeting now. I know that some participants will be joining us as we go. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Liz Payne. I'm a member of the Communist Party's Executive and Political Committee, and I'll be chairing the event this evening. And I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar, A Woman's Body is Not a Workplace, in which the Communist Party panelists will explain our party's position against the full decriminalisation of prostitution. This meeting is taking place ahead of International Women's Day on Saturday and ahead of the Women's TUC conference, which starts tomorrow and goes on until Friday. We have four wonderful panelists and I shall introduce them in turn. They're going to speak for approximately 10 minutes each. And after that, we'll have some time for the panelists to answer questions. Please let me explain that the chat is switched off. So please, can those of you who are on this call and who want to ask questions, please put those questions in the Q&A section, and we will monitor them. Quite clearly, we will not have a chance to answer everyone's questions, but we are going to keep a copy of the text, the script, so we will be in articles and things that we write up afterwards, able to take your questions and respond to, I hope, most of them. So we are going to go in the order of Micaela, and then followed by Charlie, then followed by Robyn, and then followed by Mary. And as I say, I shall take everyone I shall introduce in turn. So I'm going to start with Micaela. Micaela is the industrial organizer for the Young Communist League, the YCL. She is on the National Executive Committee of Unison, which I want to remind everyone is the largest trade union in the country and which has 80% women, most of them low paid. Public Services Union. Micaela is speaking in her own capacity here this evening. On the NEC of Unison, she represents young members. And Micaela is a shop steward in local government. Micaela, over to you. Very welcome. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Liz, for that introduction. I'm really proud to be speaking alongside some great panelists today at this event, A Women's Body is Not a Workplace, but International Women's Day, and as a young woman trade unionist. I think it's really important to remember the origins of International Women's Day, which came from the struggle of women workers struggling for their rights to organise and their rights as working class women. The current situation for women workers today under capitalism is dire. Women are at the sharp edge of the austerity agenda and crisis in our public services. Women often occupy the lowest paid jobs in the economy, are more likely to be on precarious contracts, and bear the most responsibility for childcare. With skyrocketing costs of childcare, women are often forced to work exploitative 0-hours contracts to make ends meet or pay a significant amount of their pay into childcare. And as the welfare state continues to shrink, women are much more reliant on the state support to survive. Mostly inadequate support, pushing women into a further cycle of poverty. Women make up most of the workers in public services, so suffer the most under a political agenda of privatisation and cuts. In a time where women are disproportionately suffering the impacts of austerity, it is vitally important that the TUC's position on the sex industry rightfully is still understood clearly as exploitation, and the TUC still support the Nordic model. To be a trade unionist is to fight against exploitation in all of its forms. At the TUC Women's Conference tomorrow, from elements of our movement, we face a fight which cuts to the heart of these principles, a push by male-dominated unions for our movement to support the decriminalisation of prostitution and the legitimisation that prostitution is a legitimate form of work or an individual choice. Let's be clear. The decriminalisation of prostitution does not benefit or serve the interests of women workers, but the interests of pimps, traffickers, and exploiters. It is essential, then, that as a movement which fights for dignity and justice for all workers, we reject the attempts to normalise this industry of exploitation. Let us begin by addressing a fundamental truth. Despite what the decriminalisation crowd say, prostitution is not like other jobs. It is not comparable to working in a shop, an office, or a factory. It is an industry built on the sale of the most intimate aspects of a person's body and overwhelmingly affects the most marginalised in society, working class women, migrants, and vulnerable people. If we as trade unionists accept that someone can consent to sell their body for survival, we accept a world where poverty, inequality, and a lack of opportunity can determine someone's worth. Can we, in good conscience, endorse an industry that thrives on desperation, that tells young women struggling under austerity and economic hardship that their best option is to sell sex? No. Prostitution requires in and of itself the subjugation of women and girls. No amount of regulation or legal reform can change the fundamental nature of an industry that profits off of oppression. What is the movement saying to women? What is the movement saying to women workers? That our bodies are commodities, that sexual exploitation is a legitimate form of work. Trade unionists have often fought for safe and dignified workplaces, but let's ask ourselves, is it possible to make prostitution a safe profession? In every other industry, workplace hazards can be mitigated through regulation. If a construction worker faces danger, we can introduce safety equipment, and if a factory worker is at risk, we can demand better conditions. But how do you regulate against the fundamental risks of prostitution? How do you stop the physical and psychological trauma that so many in the industry experience? How do you protect someone from the everyday reality of sexual violence, degradation, and harm? The simple answer is you can't. What other jobs are there where unwanted pregnancies, sexually transmitted diseases, rape, and other forms of extreme violence is a workplace hazard? There is simply no other form of work where this happens. If this was common practice in any other form of work, any principled trade unionist would be calling for its abolition, not its decriminalisation. So why is prostitution any different? It is clear that the sex trade is an industry of degradation and the abuse of women. Some argue that decriminalisation would offer prostitutes protections, that they would be able to report abuse without fear of arrest. But in countries where decriminalisation has been introduced, such as Germany and the Netherlands, we see the opposite. Those countries have been hubs for trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. Brothels have become factories of abuse, legitimised by the state. The prostitutes themselves remain in unsafe conditions, often more vulnerable than before. So let us ask ourselves, who stands to gain the most from decriminalisation? Advocates argue that it will improve the conditions for those in prostitution, but the reality is far more sinister. Pimps and brothel owners rebranded as business managers stand to gain. Traffickers, emboldened by a system that legitimises their trade, stand to gain. The sex industry, driven by profit rather than the welfare of the prostituted women, stand to gain. But the women and girls who sell sex, they do not. They remain vulnerable as ever, facing violence, still living under economic desperation, still controlled by those who exploit them. The reality is that decriminalisation does not empower the exploited women, it empowers the exploiters. When prostitution is treated as a job like any other, we send a dangerous message that men have a right to purchase sex and that the society must accommodate this demand. How can anyone see this as progressive? The whole point of the sex industry is that it offers men the chance to buy sexual access to women who otherwise do not want to have sex with them. Decriminalisation seeks to legitimise the myth that it's possible to commodify sexual consent and commodify women's bodies. Who benefits from this? Women, or a society which regards women as nothing more than sexual objects which can be bought and sold? It is clear that it is a clear power imbalance between pimps and brothel owners, often well off, and the prostituted women, often women in a cycle of poverty with no concept of exiting the industry. Decriminalisation would legalise these exploiters. This isn't progress, this is a backward step. As trade unionists, we must stand for policies that protect the exploited rather than legitimising their oppression. This is why, as a movement, we must continue our support for the Nordic model. The Nordic model does not criminalise those who sell sex. Instead, it criminalises those who create the demand, the buyers, pimps, and the traffickers. It recognises prostitution for what it is, a system of exploitation that must be dismantled and not endorsed. Countries like Sweden, Norway, and France have implemented this model. They have seen a reduction in prostitution and trafficking, and they have invested in exit programs that provide an alternative for those who are trapped in the sex trade. They have recognised that no woman should be forced to sell their body to survive. This is what we as trade unionists should stand for, not in defence of a system that exploits the most vulnerable, but a fight for a world where no one has to endure such conditions in the first place. Comrades, our movement has always fought for justice. We have never accepted the argument that bad work is better than no work, and we should never endorse the systems of exploitation simply because they exist. As trade unionists, we have fought to challenge the basis of our exploitation. I think we're at a crossroads. Do we accept, as a movement, prostitution as inevitable, as something that needs to be regulated or managed? Or do we fight for a world where no woman is forced into it in the first place? Do we stand with the exploited or those who profit from their suffering? I urge everyone at TUC Women's Conference tomorrow to take a stand against decriminalisation. Let us fight for real alternatives, better housing, stronger working protections, and an alternative economic model that addresses the structural issues and why many are forced into prostitution. Let us build a society where no one has to sell their body to survive. The only way forward to progress the rights of women is through a labour movement which is class-conscious and anti-sexist. We must articulate in the movement that the guiding principle for women's liberation is the abolition of class exploitation, sex-based oppression, and racism. We must expose our super exploitation as workers and continue to develop the class consciousness of women workers. In the movement, I urge all trade unionists to stand with their sisters, reject the calls for decriminalisation of the sex industry, which seeks to exploit and subjugate women, and fight together for the true liberation of women and our class.
Thank you so much, Micaela. That was an absolutely great opening and so comprehensive. And I'm sure that questions are going to be appearing in the chat. Sorry, in the Q&A very, very, very quickly. But that was really an excellent opening. I do thank you very much. I'm going to now move to Charlie. Charlie is a member of Hackney and Tower Hamlets branch of our party. She runs her own consultancy, providing strategic support to social profit organisations and groups. Part of Charlie's work includes designing political and organisational processes using group analytic methods. Marx is a frequent reference for group analytic theory and practice, and the history of the school is aligned in many ways. That is one of the reasons we've invited Charlie to join the panel this evening. Charlie, you're very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Micaela. A bit of me doesn't really want to say anything else. That was a masterclass in speechwriting and presentation, if nothing else. Thank you. It's an honour to be alongside you this evening. I want to begin with a core concept of group analytic theory, that of the matrix. The matrix contains all ideological, material and emotional experience, and we are constantly exposed to and developing it. Paraphrased from Hopper, a contemporary group analyst, in group analysis, the species underpins the matrix in the same way that in any society, the substructure underpins the superstructure. We make and are made by the matrix. It is the context into which we are born, as well as that we constantly create. So while I was thinking about the range of the underpinnings and the superstructure of what has become known as the sex industry and its role in the matrix, I was reminded of the term the military-industrial complex, coined by Eisenhower in 1961. The term went on to be popularised and expanded by Angela Davis in the 90s to encompass the prison industrial complex, all the range of public, private and civil society institutions, organisations that are involved in and profit from prisons and the criminal justice system. So given the extent of the influence, relationships and mutually beneficial interests involved for this evening, I thought it was appropriate to consider the sexualised industrial complex as a useful way to conceptualise the highly sophisticated global network of interests, apparatus and tools that create a joint enterprise around the sale of women's bodies. The Centre to End All Sexual Exploitation, CEASE, I think sum it up really well. Quote, as a legitimate industry, the selling of sex warrants infrastructure and third-party involvement. This approach means no criminal sanctions against those involved in the sex industry, conveniently leads to the growth of the sex industry, a subsequent boom in clandestine prostitution and sex trafficking. All of this leads, of course, to high tax revenue, end quote. Presumably, as Micaela so clearly pointed out, this is partly why the Nordic model has yet to be implemented in the UK. So while women's bodies are not a workplace, it's clear that a great deal of material, superstructural benefit is derived from their sale, exchange and trade. At the same time, the impact of the sexualised industrial complex in the matrix sustains the idea that there is no class struggle, no exploitation, sex or race-based oppression. Any woman anywhere need never be without access to money. All she needs to do to survive is sell sex. Which leads me to my second point, that the very idea of sex work is a euphemism that obscures the inherent cultural coercion within it. Sex is a consensual act between adults. Work can be a creative endeavour for the fulfilment of human capacity, but is more usually an alienating wage-based sustenance. Sex work is a false conflation, and it describes often non-consensual sexualised and racialised acts as simple financial transactions. This distortion creates conditions in which sexualised exploitation, as Micaela's already explained really clearly, can be reframed as an empowering choice. Thirdly, I want to introduce a second core concept in group analytic theory, the location of disturbance. This concept suggests that feelings, experiences and ideas that are too distressing to acknowledge are unconsciously projected onto a particular individual or group, in this case women, who are labelled as deviant, desperate or money-grabbing and entrepreneurial, either way complicit in their own exploitation. This projection allows society to distance itself from the uncomfortable truth that prostitution is not an individual but a systemic issue. From a group analytic perspective, prostitution functions as a location of disturbance in women cross-culturally. At its core, the disturbance is twofold. Firstly, there is a moral disturbance. Women who engage in prostitution are framed as lacking virtue, values or purity. And secondly, there is a social disturbance. Women in prostitution are perceived as, on the one hand, exciting, enticing and aspirational, and on the other, desperate, degenerate and socially undesirable, reinforcing the belief that they chose or deserve this reality, rather than being groomed into the complex by structural inequalities. This is the location of disturbance. A woman chooses to work rather than a social and economic system promoting and normalising her sexualised exploitation. It's an often cited defence of the so-called sex trade that women participate freely and make good money. While it is true that women engaged in sexualised exploitation and abuse experience different levels and frequency of direct violence, coercion and threat, the work of Julia O'Connell Davidson distills well the fact that all are subject to three fundamental dynamics. 1. Dehumanisation and what is known as social death. The punter buys an experience, a fantasy, a performance. The woman withholds her desires, preferences and/or genuine affect in order to satisfy her customer. This is the opposite of bringing your whole self to work and is probably as close to alienation as it's possible to arrive. 2. Racialised enactment. The purchase of a body enables, encourages and elicits the temporary suspension of usual cultural or social expectations. In this state, the customer is liberated to express and transgress racialised abuses, intent and harm. The purchased body is already an object upon which heavily racialised fantasy can be enacted without judgment, rejection or lasting consequence to the customer. And thirdly, no refusals. If the motivation of the seller is to make money, the capacity for denying or refusing clients is limited. The fewer customers served, the less money made. This is a glaring contradiction to the idea of the free and liberated self-employed woman choosing to engage in sex acts for a glamorous living. Racialised, sexualised abuse is not work. It is a social relation built on and sustained by women's oppression. The political left, by and large, present company accepted, fails to take these issues seriously or to prioritise solidarity with women in its policies. In the last week, the UK government has responded to two separate pieces of relevant legislation, the Independent Pornography Review and the Online Safety Act. The Act is designed to ensure an online space that, quote, does not allow misogyny, sexism and gender-based violence to go unchecked, unquote. It seems contradictory to undertake such a consultation or review in the light of the popularisation of platforms such as OnlyFans and Pornhub. These online marketplaces are often hailed as progress for women's liberation, when materially they expand and extend the sexualised industrial complex, capitalised not by individual women, but by ruling interests. My final point is the creation of new social relations. I think Micaela's already covered this as well. Ultimately, while it's not popular to say, it is men that have the ultimate choice at the point of transaction. While they may face peer pressure, they are unlikely to be at risk of violence, extortion, threat, or murder for opting out of exploitation. The Marxist interrogation of any policy or practice surely must be focused on sophisticated modes of social interaction towards unlimited human progress and development. In conclusion, the abolition of racism and sexism is fundamental to women's and class liberation. True liberation does not come from repackaging exploitation as empowerment. It comes from dismantling the systems that make the sale of women's bodies appear liberating. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Charlie. And I just want to say what a wonderful speech complimenting the first contribution that was. That is absolutely great. And again, I think that the Q&A, which we can now all see, we've been asked by the organisers if we can see it. Yes, we can. And I think the Q&A will start to fill with your questions. But Charlie, that was absolutely great. Thank you very, very much indeed. I now want to move to our third speaker, which is Robyn Martyn. Robyn is a care worker and she is a trade union activist in Scotland. She actually said that's all you need to say about me before I start speaking. But I am going to say, Robyn, that you're a wonderful member of the party and the YCL, but she is also one of our superb young speakers. And if any of you have any chance sometime soon to Google Robyn Martyn, Glasgow, May Day 2024, you will find an 8-minute speech that she made, and it will warm your heart. So she's an excellent speaker, and some of you know her as a writer too, writing very, very comprehensive articles for us to read, explaining very clearly the point she wants to make. Over to you, Robyn.
Thank you very much, Liz. Was not expecting quite an introduction. Thank you so much. And thank you to Micaela and Charlie for two incredibly cohesive and insightful speeches. You are both absolutely excellent sisters, and I'm incredibly proud to be platformed alongside you as we unpack this issue. So today I was kind of asked to talk about the Liberal take of decriminalisation in the sex industry, but I'd quite like to start by digging a wee bit deeper, just to develop a bit more of an understanding of how we kind of landed in this modern context of, you know, why there's a sort of need for a self-organised, female-led opposition to decriminalisation at all. So there might be people on here who maybe don't know a lot about what decriminalisation is. It's basically a liberal solution to the problems which arise from the sex trade, which we all know about, and which were, you know, covered very well by Micaela and Charlie. But it essentially involves removing all criminal consequences from those who buy sex and for the pimps themselves, which in turn enables brothel keeping and legitimising the trading of sex is just another business prospect, among other very damaging consequences. So taking it back even thousands of years ago, it is through the advent of private property via slave ownership that women's bodies initially became subordinate. So this is, you know, going back tens of thousands of years ago, you know, when trade began to develop from agriculture, it indoctrinated in society a sense of ownership. You know, in a society whose social organisation was heavily male-dominated. Private ownership of livestock and land emerged, which caused a bit of a ripple effect in class antagonisms between those who owned land, etc., and those who didn't. And the home transitioned into a private domain and essentially a prison for women, a place which was once in previous societies, like your primitive communist societies, embedded in collectivism. So women were consequently forced out of social isolation and isolated and confined to the role of mothers and domestic and sexual slaves, essentially. And their bodies therefore became a commodity, and their families could even sell them as wives without consent. And it's from this dynamic that prostitution was born. So throughout modes of production, women's oppression has always existed, and prostitution has always endured because of its close links to family structures. So where classic society has existed, so too has prostitution. The two are completely inseparable. So the historical context is so important to consider here, which is why I thought I would begin with that, to understand the gravity of the statement that a woman's body is not a workplace. In today's liberal society, as Micaela was covering, there are so many physical dangers which prevail within it. In terms of the sex industry, the Nordic Model Now conducted a 9-country peer-reviewed study which collected data from 854 prostitutes, and it found that, just to give you some statistical insight here, 73% had reported they'd been physically assaulted, 64% reported that they'd been threatened with a weapon, and 57% reported that they'd been raped. And underpinning all that, it is estimated that 74% of women across the sex industry are in poverty. So these women cite childcare responsibilities and the cost of living as key motivators for entering the sex work. So it's very clear here how family structures and the linkage between that and women, you know, there's a historic linkage there. It goes back to slave society, and it has prevailed all the way through to capitalist society. And today we so often see liberalism attempt to entrench itself in our minds as normal and even liberating, whereas in reality, decriminalisation and its attempts to endeavour to label prostitution as nothing more than work conflates sexual exploitation and labour exploitation, when in actual fact, labour exploitation is the imbalance of power between employers and workers. And that employers must exploit workers in order to make a profit. And to do that, the employer or capitalist sells the commodities produced by the worker for less than their value. However, this is the key point. What separates sexual exploitation and labour exploitation most crucially is the fact that a woman's body in that equation is not a worker. She is the commodity. She just merely has to exist to be a commodity. She isn't producing anything. And the employer in that scenario is the pimp, the one who's selling that commodity, her body. So there are no workers in this scenario. It is purely a dynamic of people who have been commercially sexually exploited and the pimps who sexually exploit them. So it's very clear to see here how dangerous decriminalisation is for women. It completely redefines women as sexual objects that can be commodified. And in the trade union context, there are simply no wins for workers because there aren't any to organise. The only gains that can be made are for pimps and for punters. So just to bring it on to I really want to encourage a lot of the women here tonight who maybe be going to the women's TUC in the next coming days. And I just also want to firstly actually discuss a wee bit about the work that has been actually going on behind the scenes that maybe some people don't know about or maybe want to be involved in, who can of course let us know in the Q&A box. But it's a lot of the women who will be attending as volunteers or perhaps even delegates I've came from a self-organised, female-led group named the Trade Union and Feminist Coalition, who are also comprised of different women's organisations as well, including Nordic Model Now. And this coalition offers a real opposition and united front against the threat of liberal narratives in our trade unions. And over the next few days at the TUC Women's Conference, sisters will be mobilising at Congress House in London, speaking to sisters in person in the movement directly about two incredibly damaging motions put forward by ASLEF and GMB, two very male-dominated unions, which will be up for debate. These are motions 8 and 9, and they will argue for full decriminalisation of the sex trade, and they will put forward a debate of how sex work is work. These may very well sound very progressive on paper, but what they are neglecting to acknowledge is that where decriminalisation is implemented and the purchase of sex is normalised, there is an increase in sex trafficking. Pimps and punters have all criminal consequences removed, and what we will see is a rapid expansion of the sex trade, and it is us as women, as workers, who will feel the weight of that if passed at Congress. So it is so crucial that we stand shoulder to shoulder with those attending, either as delegates and volunteers, in complete and total solidarity as they enter such a treacherous debate, which is unfortunately having to be platformed and showcased during a trade union democratic process. So it is so crucial for the men and women here in the labour movement to stand up for and defend the very hard-fought wins, achieved by women through the ages to get us to this point at all. We must continually endeavour to be brave and bold and challenge any and all threats to women's liberation, both within and out with the trade union context. So let us build a united front against prostitution and the double and triple exploitation that underpins it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robyn. That was again such a clear explanation, explaining the background and the theory, but at the end then telling us what we need to do about it, what we need to go out and organise and not stand for it, what we need to do together, and bringing it right down to what we need to do tomorrow and on Thursday at the TUC Women's Conference. Thank you very, very much indeed, and we will again come back to questions that will be put in the question and answer for you. Thank you so much. Lastly, I want to, I was going to say introduce Mary Davies. I don't think that Mary perhaps needs so much introduction to many, many of you. But Mary is the author of Women and Class, which is the Marxist theory of women's oppression and exploitation. Mary was also the initial instigator of the Charter for Women, which is now looked after by the National Assembly of Women, and was supported by so many trade unions nationally. It seems that some of them have forgotten what they originally signed up to in that charter. There is so much that I could say about Mary, but actually I think Mary will be able to come in and speak extremely well of herself and for herself in this. So I'm going to pass to Mary. The floor is yours, Mary.
Thanks very much, Liz. And thank you to the three previous speakers. It doesn't leave much to say, actually, but you've all been fantastic. And I'm going to join in and say it's a privilege to be on this panel. So the current debate on prostitution has got this accompanying mantra that sex work is work. And I think this prompts a Marxist analysis of the meaning of work and the payment for work in a capitalist society, but it encourages also an analysis of class society. Sorry. And I make no apology for saying that this is what I'd like to speak about, because we are a Marxist still in this party, and I think we are guided by the most advanced theory, which is Marxism. So the title of this webinar is that a women's body is not a workplace, and that in a way is essentially what we have to prove. It's obvious that it's not, but some people seem to be happy with that. So in Marxist theory, work is a fundamental aspect of human life and social organisation, but its form, function and meaning change depending on the mode of production, and that is to say the mode of production operating in class society, slavery, feudalism and now capitalism. Labour refers to the actual work performed by individuals, and it encompasses lots of forms of productive society. But in contrast to all other economists, political economists and political theorists, Marx makes a key distinction between work, labour, if you like, because you have to labour in order to work, as a natural human activity, and wage labour under capitalism, which he terms labour power. So there's a crucial distinction between labour, work and labour power. And labour power is distinct from actual labour because it's the potential to work which can be bought and sold in the labour market. Labour power is a commodity, and capitalism is characterised by commodity production. Workers sell their labour power to capitalists in exchange for wages, and this transaction is unique because the commodity being sold is inseparable for the worker. So I think probably most people know a little bit about Marxist theory and what surplus value is, which is the basis for profit in all capitalist economies. Workers who own nothing except their own labour power, they can't own the means of production because they are very costly things. The means of production in factories and mechanised workplaces are impossible for an individual to own. We've gone past, in advanced industrial capitalism, we've gone past the sort of the handicraft industry into machine production, which of course started off in this country in late 18th, early 19th century initially in the cotton industry. But the point about this is that because workers earn nothing except their own labour power, that's what they're forced to sell in order to live. This will become, I think, relevant to the discussion on prostitution in a moment, but I think it's important to establish some basic principles about what work and what labour and what the wage is. So workers sell their labour power for a wage, and the capitalists purchase labour power of the workers in order to extract surplus value, which, as I said, is the basis for profit. So what is a wage? As I say, it's the monetary, the phrase used is that the wage is the monetary expression of the value of labour power. And that is the only thing, as I said before, that a worker has to sell. So what is the value of labour power? It's determined, according to Marx, by the amount of socially necessary labour time required to produce and reproduce the means of subsistence of the worker. And that is socially determined. And we could look into this much more closely, but the fact is that there is an inbuilt super exploitation. That exploitation exists. Super exploitation is because women have always historically earned less than men. So in other words, they do reproduce the next generation of workers, but they're not paid at the same rate as male workers. And that's something that obviously we're not going to go into today. I wish we could, but it's because if we're going to analyse sex, what's sometimes called the gender pay gap, I prefer to call it the sex pay gap. We have to look back at this, and it's really inherent, really, because of something that that Robyn said, and that is that the oppression and the super exploitation of women has occurred in all forms of class society. So we're bequeathed this inherent oppression from one form of class society to another, from slavery to feudalism to capitalism. So the value of labour power, as I said, is determined by the socially necessary labour time, but let's not dwell on that too much. What I want to look at is what that means for sex work and prostitution. So if we can start off with and you accept the premise that labour power is sold to the owners of the means of production in order to produce commodities, then the labour power of workers results in external product or service, and their bodies remain their own. In contrast, prostitution involves granting clients direct access to a woman's body for sexual activities, making the body itself central to the transaction. And therefore, it's the woman's body and not labour power that becomes the commodity. I think the previous speakers have talked about this, have mentioned this. The woman's body becomes a commodity which is sold for a fee, and a fee is not the same as a wage. So in all forms of class society, not just capitalism, prostitution commodifies the individual's body in this way, but not as part of the dominant means and mode of production. So it bypasses, in a sense, class relations of production, but it does not bypass class society. And I think it was Robyn who was actually quoting Engels a bit in looking at the real historic origins of women's oppression, which Engels said coincides with the development of class society. In fact, he says that when class society it began to exist, when society was able to produce a surplus, and the surplus was appropriated by the male, Engels says that class society witnessed the world historic defeat of the female sex. And that world historic defeat, thousands and thousands of years ago, is bequeathed to us now. But the woman's body, or in all forms of class society, the selling of a woman's body has always existed. And of course, it does coincide and is linked to the family form, because the wife was owned by the husband in most forms of society. And even in the 19th century, you still saw wife sales. The woman was a commodity. This is class society and ownership and private property. And the wife was often forced to wear chastity belts because the man could go and have as much sex as he liked outside the family. Of course, the woman couldn't. So prostitution commodifies the individual's body, but as I say, not part of the dominant means of mode of production, part of all forms of class society. But in capitalist society, the relations of production refer to the social relations that emerge in the process of producing commodities. And this creates a fundamental division between those who own and control the means of production and those who don't. So what does that mean for prostitution? Well, whilst paid for sex commodifies the woman's body, satisfying male sexual fantasies in the process, it cannot be classified as productive labour. The prostituted sexual abuse of women's bodies is the product and manifestation of women's oppression throughout recorded history, irrespective of the mode of production. And Engels also said that it degrades the character of the entire male world. Well, it certainly does, but that's because women are oppressed, and they're oppressed by, well, they are oppressed. So the point is that prostitution exists in a completely different relationship to work as produced by workers who sell their labour power. And that then raises the question as to whether or not this is a trade union issue, a point that I'll come on to in a moment. So labour power, therefore, is central to the process of capital accumulation, the bedrock of which is profit, and profit, as we said, arises from surplus value. So when workers sell their labour power, they work for a certain period to produce value equivalent to their wages. That's what's known as necessary labour. But capitalists require workers to work beyond this period. That's what generates surplus value. So this additional labour performed after the necessary labour time is the surplus value, which is appropriated by capitalists without compensation. So this is what we call exploitation, i.e. people working for more than what they're paid for, which is what we all do. That is the essence of surplus value, whether it's in the public or private sector. So exploitation is obviously it's a term that's commonly used just to express unfairness, but it's got a precise meaning in Marxist political economy, because exploitation means the surplus labour which creates surplus value, the source of profit. So this is where trade unions come in, because the cycle of investment, production and reinvestment drives capitalist economies, but it also perpetuates the ever-increasing exploitation of workers and the super-exploitation of women workers. And this is really the role of trade unions, that the drive to limit exploitations is the essence of class struggle, is the essence really of the battle between capital and labour. In other words, combating the downward pressure on wages and working conditions is the task of trade unions. Trade unions are the organised expression of workers' collective response to exploitation under capitalism. That is their raison d'etre. That's why they exist. I think we all know that. So that does raise a question then about what sex work therefore means for trade unions. Trade unions have got policies on many, many social and political issues of national and international concern, quite rightly so. But their primary function remains one of bargaining and representing workers who sell their labour power for a wage. If they didn't do that, that they would just be pressure group politics on all sorts of other things. But they've got that as their prime function. That means that they have to challenge those who pay wages. Those who pay wages are the employers of labour in the public or the private sector. And of course, the private sector is rapidly becoming, the public sector is rapidly becoming a private sector anyway. So that's an unfortunate factor, the increasing roller coaster of privatisation. So challenging those who pay wages, that's what collective bargaining is all about. But this employment relationship doesn't exist either in the case of the self-employed or in the case of those women who are forced to sell their bodies for men's sexual gratification. Who is the employer? I'm not sure that pimps are, actually. It's not quite the same. And certainly this is not what you call productive labour. So women's bodies definitely are not a workplace, but that doesn't mean that trade unions should not have an opinion on the sex for sale business. It is a business, even though it cannot meaningfully intervene in its monetary conduct. I mean, there's no sense in which there can be collective bargaining around the sale of a woman's body, in the same way that I think it was Micaela who mentioned there can be no collective bargaining about health and safety for women. I mean, for prostituted women. Actually, you couldn't do it, and it would mean abolishing the entire so-called industry. I don't like to call it an industry, but this is an impossibility. But so basically, trade unions cannot, even if they've got a moral approach to this issue, and presumably GMB and ASLEF have, because they think it's nobody should stigmatise those who sell their sex, but it's meaningless to say that without looking at the actual practical repercussions of that, because the selling of sex commercially is the most extreme expression of patriarchal dominance and women's oppression. And certainly trade unions have got a role here, but not to legitimise it, but to have a duty to oppose the commodification of women's bodies for male pleasure, and to reject the comfortable illusion that somehow sex work is freely chosen by women, which even in its most glamorous and high-end versions never escape associations with violence, threat, risk, danger, illegal activity and online abuse. The role of trade unions is to expose this on behalf of all women who are fighting against our oppression and for or everything that really underpins our oppression, which is really to do with our double burden as workers in the workplace, and then our role in domestic production, the whole childcare problems, all of this, everything which contributes to our unequal pay. We have to recognise, and certainly as communists we recognise, and I hope all socialists will recognise, that women are oppressed in capitalist society. Sex work and violence against women, which are very closely interlinked, and everybody's very concerned about violence against women, not nearly concerned enough, in my opinion. But you have to see sex work as part of this, the way in which women's bodies are used and abused. But sex work and violence against women is the extreme expression of women's oppression. We have to end women's oppression and not collude with it. And my argument, and the argument I think of all the panelists here, would be to see that trying to decriminalise sex work is part of colluding with women's oppression and colluding with women's oppression in class society. We have to challenge capitalism, and we have to see that the only way that women can be free is when the bonds which tie us, which are absolutely intrinsic to capitalist class society, will be severed. There can be no ifs, ands or buts about this, and to have a campaign which seeks to, in essence, legitimise violence, continued violence against women, sexual violence against women, and and the commodification of women's bodies is something that we have to oppose. So I earnestly hope that those two motions will be roundly defeated. If they're not defeated, I can tell you what will happen. They will go to the TUC main Congress in September, and they will be passed because it will be said, well, the Women's Conference agreed to it, so it must be okay. There is a strain and a trend within our movement that has to be exposed, and it's a train and a trend which is basically anti-woman in the sense that it refuses to recognise, because it's so concerned with identity politics, that it refuses to recognise the collective voice of women, and our collective voice must be heard. We must not collude with our oppression. We must fight those who want to collude with it. And the notion that sex work is work is part of that collusion. And let's hope we win. Dare to struggle, dare to win.
Well, thank you so very, very much for that, Mary. That was absolutely superb. I think it was very, very fitting, perhaps, that was the last of the 4 contributions, because you were able to draw theoretically and explain to us in practical terms what are the roots of the issues, what are the ways forward, what we have to do. So thank you very, very much for that. We're now moving into question and answer. I should say that we were aiming to finish the meeting by 8:30-ish. We can perhaps extend it by 5 or 10 minutes. I don't know what anyone thinks for that. I think it would be perhaps a good idea. We're getting quite a lot of questions. Someone has asked whether the speeches will be available after the meeting. They will be, but not immediately. We will print the texts, and they will become available. I'm thinking that we should perhaps take a group of 3 questions, perhaps, and then let the speakers respond to them. So I want to say there have been several questions actually about the motion itself that is coming to the TUC. And I think perhaps since that question was written down, several speakers have spoken about it. But if there's anything that anyone wanted to add on that motion and what's involved in it, please to do so. And someone has asked, would it be reasonable to compare sex work and prostitution to child labour in terms of our analysis and approach to these issues? So if we can have a look at that one. A couple of questions on the Nordic model. So if we take the Nordic model as the 3rd area to explore here. Given the dilemmas facing the government at the moment, how do you see this government beginning the journey towards the implementation of the Nordic model? And are there any issues with the Nordic models currently implemented in liberal societies, and what could be done to improve them? So 3 areas there, and please don't every speaker think you need to respond to all 3 in detail. But if you'd like to come in to make any points, and then we'll have time perhaps for a second round of questions. So where should we start? Shall we start with, I think perhaps Robyn, would you like to come back to start with?
Hiya. I was going to answer the first part, but I just want to get a look at the actual motions themselves. I do have a copy on my phone. Is it okay to come back to me?
Yes, I'll come back to you. Let's
Thank
go
you.
to Charlie, shall we? Charlie.
Sure. In terms of child labour, I think the most obvious answer is to say it was outlawed. We don't have child labour. It's illegal. So that's a really great example, I think. And in this country, child labour is not allowed because it was so outrageously, obviously harmful and inappropriate. I think Nordic model implementation will only work if it's part of a much wider appraisal of what women's rights might mean. And in January, I think of this year, the National Audit Office reported not only an underspend in the violence against women strategy, but a complete failure to have had any impact whatsoever on violence against women, despite its, I think, 2-year attempts. So it's part of a much bigger strategic deployment of policies and actions around women's rights. And as Mary said, the kind of conception of what women are and the capacity for women's voices to be heard and taken seriously.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Charlie. Micaela, did you want to come back?
Yeah, I'll just touch on the Nordic model. So obviously the Nordic model's approach to prostitution is as we've outlined before, is decriminalising selling sex, providing support services to help those exit, and makes paying for sex a criminal offence, to try and like reduce trafficking, etc., outlaw pimps. But the you know, in liberal societies, when we're living under a capitalist society where women are still oppressed, obviously I think that it's a step forward, but like Charlie said, needs to be part of the wider challenge to and struggle of class society, and understanding women's oppression through our oppression in under capitalism, if that makes sense. In terms of child labour, I think they're different, separate issues. As Mary outlined in her answer, prostitution is the sort of expression of women's oppression, and so they're two separate issues, I think. And okay. I think I'm going to let Robyn come back on the motion, but can expand a bit more on trade unions maybe a bit later on.
Okay, thank you very much. Mary, did you want to come back?
I think it's been said, to be honest, but just one word on child labour. It wasn't because people felt sorry for children. What was happening was that, at least in this country, in the early years of industrialisation, the child labour was resulting in the next generation of workers really not being not physically able to exist. The life expectancy in the cotton districts of Manchester was something like 17 in 1832. I mean, you know, in other words, they were killing the next generation of workers. They had to stop it. Infant mortality was massive as well. But child labour is not the same. Children were selling their labour power, obviously being exploited beyond belief. That's not the same as prostitution. It's not the same as selling sex. That's our whole point. What we're saying is that we cannot have that mantra, sex workers work, not in the way in which we are, or Marxists analyse what work is. That was what I was trying to say in my talk, maybe not very well.
Okay, thank you very much. I wonder whether Robyn's ready to come back now. Robyn?
Hiya. So I just wanted to both motions are quite similar, but I just wanted to just kind of, we don't really have time for me to read them out, they are quite long, but just to briefly summarise what both of them are saying, neither are sort of evidence-based, in my view, motions that are put forward. There's a real failure here to acknowledge the truth behind the sex industry, and in terms of the physical dangers, and what Micaela was talking about, the fact that no other industry or workforce has, you know, the risk of contracting an STD, you know, a very high risk of contracting an STD, or being raped or sexually assaulted, or I could go on. There's a real plethora of physical dangers that aren't being addressed in either motion. You know, there's also points in the motions in regards to whether or not women and mothers especially would be worse off. I think they're arguing that decriminalisation would mean that mothers and women in general who enter the sex industry, but particularly mothers, would feel some form of liberation. But the facts in studies like the ones I was talking about actually prove the contrary, the complete and entire contrary. So the main takeaway from each motion is that neither are evidence-based whatsoever.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my main point I want to make on that.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for going and getting the text for us, Robyn. That's absolutely great. Let's have another 3 questions then. Pretty Woman, it becomes pretty clear that there's an international ideological promotion of the idea that prostitution is glamorous and empowering. I was wondering if any of the speakers had thoughts on this phenomena. Next, the body as a commodity also applies to those who sell plasma, semen or surrogacy. Would the panel recognise this equivalency? Or is there a difference, for example, psychological perhaps? And the final question in this set, the book Revolting Prostitutes, The Fight for Sex Workers' Rights, argues in favour of decriminalisation. Can you suggest books that oppose it? So where shall we start? Mary, do you want to go first?
No, not really.
No, probably not.
Yes, a fight for sex workers' rights. A good book against it. I need to think about that. I can't, not off the top of my head. Perhaps somebody else has got an idea. I might come up with something. The body as a commodity. Yes, I think all sorts of people might, on a one-off basis, sell parts of their body or in desperation. But I think we're talking about a sort of an industry, which is a little bit different. And people always come on about the oldest profession. Well, it is very old, and this is women selling their bodies or allowing their bodies to be commodified. No, they don't allow it. That's the system that makes their bodies become commodities. I'm not sure it is quite the same as. I'm not sure. Is the answer to that. I'm really not sure. You shouldn't have asked me first. I've got to think about this.
Okay, well, we'll come back to you if you go. We'll come back when we've been. What about? Shall we go to Robyn next? Just trying to vary the order a bit. Sorry.
That's fine. So I think a good read that I've definitely encouraged others to read would be Decriminalisation versus the Nordic Model, and it is a Nordic Model now published book on this. It's very simple, very straightforward. It articulates and frames both sides very, very well, I think, and uses a lot of sort of evidence-based approaches to explain both sides, including countries that have implemented both, etc. So I would recommend that as a good starting point, especially if you're new to the topic. In terms of the question on intentional ideological promotion, I think that's something that we see. It obviously starts, at least in the modern context, it's propelled through kind of social media, film and theatre and things like that, as we see in films like Pretty Women and things. But obviously, as we've been talking about today, it's an issue that has filtered into our trade unions. It's becoming an issue that is, at everybody's front door at this point. But what it actually is, it's a tactic, and it's to disguise what is the regression of women's rights in its most poignant form. That's basically my take on it.
Okay, thanks very much. And Charlie.
Yeah, I'm trying to look at all these different things coming in. I wanted to say, I think Robyn was just talking about popular culture as part of, it's an ideologically informed and influenced apparatus, isn't it? It's part of A, the matrix, and B, the superstructure and that, of course, there's an anti-female drive and popularity of identity politics, and particularly gender ideologies, careering at a rate unknown previously, and it runs through all of these. I'm looking at there was another long question that I didn't get to read about OnlyFans, and that's why, to me, I saw another question: is sex work the right language? Absolutely not. It's neither sex or work, for all the reasons that we've heard tonight. It's not sex work, it's sexualized abuse and exploitation, in my opinion. And I think that is part of a global ideology that has long historical roots, again, as we've heard tonight. And that's why it has to be seen as an industrial complex, and each component piece has to be identified and challenged, because it compounds and becomes normalized and naturalized. So it looks like, of course, women are in control having an OnlyFans account. What's wrong with that?
Okay, thank you very much.
You want me to come back in? I've just got a few things.
Oh, yes, please. Sorry, Micaela, sorry.
That's fine, don't worry. I just have a couple of things to add, particularly on the sort of promotion of prostitution as as something glamorous, something that is like an individual choice that can even be empowering. And I think someone did comment already in the chat about a film. I mean, I don't watch the Oscars, but like a film that won, and people were getting up and saying, "I stand with the sex work community," which is obviously sort of a product of the bourgeois capitalist system that we're living under at the moment, particularly, that shows itself in these things like the Oscars and stuff in Hollywood. But it's in the interest of the ruling class and bourgeoisie to subjugate women, and particularly in liberal society, it's the argument of it's an individual choice, is empowerment, rather than a system of oppression which oppresses women. And I think that's the difference. And I think people have touched on identity politics, and in today's society, people are seeing themselves and the struggles as individual issues and as individual choices, rather than connecting it to wider structural problems. And I think that's where it lies, where we're having the issue at the moment, with the rise of identity politics, which over class politics, which has seeped into all elements of the trade union movement even. This is where we're finding the issue of it's an individual choice, it's empowering for women, and it's in the ruling class interest to do that and to divide us on these issues. So I think that's why it's important we put forward the Marxist perspective on this issue and fight against individualism in the movement and for a collective response. I think I wanted to also very quickly touch on surrogacy was mentioned. I do agree with Mary, it's a separate issue, but it is more of a concerning issue that I'm starting to see of very rich, well-off women paying poorer women for the use of their bodies, and it's being very normalized in sort of Western capitalist culture. And I think that's something that we also need to be aware about and fight against, but is a separate issue, I think, but also ties into women's oppression. And then another book which touches on prostitution is The Social Basis of the Women's Question by Colin Tye. Someone put that in the chat, so I thought I'd just say that for everyone. But I think that is everything.
Can I just come in? I've got another, I can't claim credit for this. Kath Campbell has just reminded me that there is a very, very good book by Julie Bindel called The Pimping of Prostitution. Oh, yeah. That is, that's one I think definitely to look at. But I can't take credit for that, although I do know the book. Thank you, Kath.
Okay, yes, thank you, Kath. And if any of the panelists think of any more literature, we've got quite a lot of questions, as you can see, about what could we read about this, and what can we and that would, so just come in on those. One more round then. We've got one problem is the transgender community, which believes that prostitution is a professional choice for them. They are politically pushing for the liberalisation of prostitution in Europe and are targeting women. How do we deal with it? And another one, sociology courses in universities are teaching that sex work is work. How can we influence academia to teach a materialist understanding of prostitution, as the speakers explained so well today? Let's take those two. Actually, let's do those two. Who'd like to come in first on that? Because I was picking on people before and
Could you
putting them on
repeat
the
the
spot.
first question, please? Sorry, I was thinking.
Oh, sorry.
I've completely forgot what the first question was.
It's about the
Sorry.
trans community favouring
Trans
prostitution.
community, yes. Sorry, I just closed my question and answer sheet so that I could see you. One problem is the transgender community, which believes that prostitution is a professional choice for them. They are politically pushing for the liberalisation of prostitution in Europe and are targeting women, How do we deal with it?
Mm.
That was the question. And the other one was about sociology courses in universities.
Well, I don't mind just having a go at universities and higher education, not just sociology courses, I can tell you. The fact is that when we talk about the world historic defeat, or Engels talked about the world historic defeat of the female sex, he didn't have 21st century Britain in mind. But I think we're seeing this here, certainly in terms of the academic world, where once we used to have women's studies departments, they don't exist anymore. Everything is gender studies. And in terms of teaching the benefits of prostitution, some universities, and I could name them, are actually encouraging students to sell their bodies and supplement their they don't get grants anymore, but to supplement their income so they can pay back their student loans. And they're giving out, or they were giving out, free guides on how to make it safe, how to do it properly and nicely. But you know, if you're going to work in, I don't know, Starbucks, you might as well, you learn more actually if you just went on the game for a bit. I mean, I find this sort of, I'm saying it lightly, but I find it shocking, absolutely shocking. And I guarantee that if any one of these people who are advocating this, I bet they wouldn't ask their own daughters or their own female relatives to do the same thing. So it's part of the, I think, this notion that somehow or other it is okay, and that we are being prudish and moralistic in decrying it. And I mean, there was a movement actually, you know, during the second wave women's movement in the 70s and 80s, which had this ridiculous notion that somehow or other that it was liberating to be sexually explicit, and even with children. I mean, but I just don't think that this. We can, not only can't advocate it. I mean, we have to really be clear why it's not just wrong morally, but it's just why it actually impacts so devastatingly badly on the perception of women, and undermines our struggle against our oppression. On the trans question, I know that this to be true, and I suppose I shouldn't be too surprised about it, because if you think about the underlying well, if we can call it theory, of behind this, which is gender identity ideology, then that leads it's the obverse of wanting of any form of collective action. So basically, you are who you say you are. You can do what you want to do, and why they are honing in particularly on prostitution, I think, or saying that this is a viable choice. Well, I think I'm going to leave the others to maybe say a word or two about that. I've got a theory which is not well. I've got a feeling about this, but let other people have a go. I think I've said too much.
Okay, on the two questions then, Charlie, do you want to come in?
Do and I don't. I mean, on the one hand, I want to say this isn't a debate about trans people. It was originally a debate about women, women's oppression, the impact of sexualized industrial complex on women and women's lives. And lo and behold, here we are yet again. So one, two, I think what's been made really clear tonight, to me anyway, is a consistent presentation about the fact that actually prostitution isn't, I don't think anybody wants prostitution. We want it abolished. So for everyone, for anyone, but we were talking about women. We've now had to start talking about trans as part of this conversation. Originally, it came up because of part of the wider ideological movement and the push and pull it's had, particularly on the left, identity politics and the impact it's having now on policy, which affects women predominantly. And I suppose one of the things that it made me think about was, I don't know enough about it in the UK, and I'm sure there are young people, poor people, people that are estranged and dislocated from their families who get involved in sexualized exploitation because of their circumstances, and that's comes under the industrialized complex as far as I'm concerned. We want it abolished. I think there is a vast difference between what happens in the US and across America and what happens in the UK. I don't know enough about it. I haven't got the research, but I'd be interested to know if actually in reality, what is happening in the UK at least is in any way similar to what's happening in the US. But I think it's really important that we'll be able to talk for an hour and a half about women, women's oppression, and actually what prostitution and the sexualized industrialized sexualized complex does to women. Why can't we do that?
Thanks very much. Micaela.
I don't have a lot to add to what's already been said. I think I will touch very briefly on the issue of, I think it was a couple of years ago, when it was was it a student union in Durham, I think, that was putting out these sort of how to participate in prostitution safely, which obviously I think is absolutely outrageous, and I think it had some kind of there was elements of like the liberal left that were embracing it, which is quite frankly, which for anyone, I think that especially if you ask them, would you be fine with you yourself doing it or your daughter doing it, they wouldn't be. But I think student unions or students need to be advocating, because students have a tough deal in Britain. They are in a lot of student debt, rents are rising, etc., etc. They need to be advocating for real better jobs for students, but also for them to be able to study without having to worry about their rent increasing to a ridiculous amount, etc., etc. So this is what student unions need to be focusing on, rather than, oh, here's a leaflet on how to participate in an extremely dangerous to participate in essentially being prostituted, and how to do it safely, which is, as we've already outlined, isn't possible. So I think that's just the sort of what I'd like to add to that.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Micaela. And Robyn.
Hiya. I just wanted to come in a wee bit on the issue to do with the sex trade sort of targeting trans people and things like that. I think it does kind of interlink quite a lot with the whole student situation as well that we're talking about, and that both are so heavily charged by identity politics. You know, like what Mary was talking about at university, gender studies are so heavily pushed. I was doing an English literature degree, for example, and it was sort of based on literature from, say, the Renaissance and things like that. And it was, you know, it was, you were sort of tasked with writing essays with a sort of postmodern gender, you know, take on it. So I understand, and I've personal experience of the sort of the challenge that poses and how fragmenting it is. It's also very difficult to understand because it doesn't actually make a lot of rational sense, especially if you've read Marx, really, I guess. But basically, in terms of believing that prostitution is a legitimate choice for them, that is absolutely fueled by identity politics. And what underpins identity politics is liberalism, and what charges that is individualism in the free market. Individualism being the component that truly isolates people, especially young women, and of course trans people as well, from becoming conscious of sex, class and race-based oppression. The free market being the factor that sort of strips us and alienates us from our humanity and therefore dehumanising us. And it's this disengagement from ourselves that our labour, that, you know, capitalism preys upon. And this absolutely demands a united front and a resistance to it across the board. And it's worth noting as well that, you know, in terms of the LGBT question, half of, in that demographic, half of them are women as well. It's still very worth noting that the majority of those prostituted are women, and it's women who are facing poverty, and it's women who are most oftentimes as well mothers. It's very worth keeping that at the very centre of the analysis here. It's also worth talking about, I think that the way trans people are targeted and sort of groomed into the sex industry is quite different. It's very fetish based. It's it's kind of hard to articulate, very hard to articulate, because it's very strange. But at the end of the day, it's broadcasted on porn, and as we know, and we've not really, I suppose, touched upon porn in and of itself as much, but it's incredibly damaging. It's incredibly dehumanising. It causes a whole plethora of problems, especially for the youth who have, you know, who access it the most. Yeah, so I think I could go on, but in the interest of time, I'll probably just stop there. But yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much for that. And sadly, everyone who is on this call, we're coming towards the end now of today. It is, of course, by no means the end of the issue. We are only just starting on this, and there is so much to do. I'm just going to say one or two things in conclusion, but just to warn the panelists, I want the last word to be theirs. So you're going to have 30 seconds each after I've ended the meeting and thanked everyone. So I really think it's important that your voices are the voices that everyone goes away with here tonight. So first of all, I want to say we should do this more often. We really should. We should, you know, it has been so incredibly valuable to hear the points of view and the coincidence and the specialities, the experience, the theory, and everything that we in our party know makes us communist. So it has been extremely valuable. And it's generated such a lot of questions, but as everybody knows, it's not only about educating and agitating. It is about organising, and this is what we have to do starting tomorrow, because this is a very serious issue at the Women's TUC. And if anyone who is on this call is in London and wants to come and help us to give out leaflets or talk to women who are there, then that help would be very, very, very greatly appreciated. I want to say thank you to everyone who has made this meeting possible, those who've organised it, those who've hosted, those who've done the technical side of things, those who've done the promotions and communications. And we've learnt a lot from doing it, and we are going to definitely do it again. I wanted to thank the 120 people who attended this meeting, but if anyone that you know missed it, there will be a recording available, and anyone who wants to look again will be able to have a look and see this, a really valuable resource. And yes, we will make a transcript of the speeches. We will make the speeches available. Thank you, of course, especially to our panelists, and you can see the comments in the chat. You have been absolutely exceptional. Thank you so much for the light that you've thrown on this and for what you've inspired us to go out and do as a result of what you said. That's enough from me, except to say that if there is anyone on this call who is interested at all to hear more about the Communist Party's perspectives on this and indeed many, many other issues, please do get in touch with us. We have a website, Facebook, and we can tell you exactly, and through the social media, exactly how to contact us. Please, please do that, and we would love to talk with you. Enough from me. 30 seconds from each panelist. Who would like to go first?
I'll go.
Okay, Robyn, great, thank you.
So I just want to say, essentially, it's never been clearer how rapidly and violently women's rights are actively being rolled back. It's so crucial that you get involved and that you take part in a real material fight back against, the erosion of women's rights, and not just in Britain but internationally. I just want to take a wee second just to pitch the Trade Unionist Feminist Coalition group, if that's okay.
Yes,
If anyone here wants to take a wee note of our email, please feel free to email us. It's tradeunionistfeministcoalition@gmail.com. And we'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. Who'd like to go next?
I will.
Mary?
Yes, I'm just going to misuse Marx or paraphrase Marx, and said that when he said philosophers try to understand the world in various ways, the point is to change it. I think women have understood the world in various ways, and definitely the point is to change it. We can only do that through collective struggle, and that is what individual identity politics actually tries to damage and to really so a collective struggle means, I think, that we need a women's movement, which is a socialist feminist women's movement, and we have just about formed one, and the inaugural meeting of the Women's Liberation Alliance will take place on the 21st of June this year, and the title of it is "And Still We Rise," and we certainly do. So please look out on all sorts of platforms to see the advert for this. It's going to be a wonderful meeting, and hopefully we are going to form a much bigger combative women's movement, which will be impossible to ignore. The assembled weight of women must be found again. Our collective strength, self-organisation has to be there, and that's what we've been lacking. That's why they've got away with all this nonsense, but that's going to end.
Thank you very much, Mary. Charlie?
Yeah, I'll go. For the sake of it, really, only because you asked, I don't think I need to say anything, but I suppose, partly an answer to a question, partly just as a thought and an action. Challenge the idea that abuse is work and that that's the best we can achieve, or that that's what women should aspire to. Challenge that in thought, in action, in your union, in your workplace, in your family. Challenge it. Challenge men. And personally, I would ask, stop saying sex work and call it sexualized abuse and exploitation wherever possible, because that's what you're paying for.
Thank you very much. And the last word to Micaela.
Thank you. I've been very proud to be on a panel of comrades and sisters. I also I think a lot has been already said, so I'm not going to repeat it. But like I said, and obviously immediately the priority is to defeat these motions at the women's conference, at TC Women's Conference, and I know a lot of work and organising has been done into this, so fingers crossed for tomorrow. But like, we need to, I've said before, we need to continue to articulate the arguments, particularly arguments of the decriminalisation, against the decriminalisation of prostitution in our trade unions, as this is becoming more and more of an issue. We need to combat identity politics in favour of class politics and collective politics, and we need to be key in this fight against individualism and liberalism, and fight together for the true liberation of women and our class. So I'll leave it as that.
Thank you very, very much. So everyone, thank you again to the panelists. Thank you all for coming, and a big thank you for all the work that you're going to organise and do to fight this, and to fight for women and their rights, and to fight against exploitation and oppression. Thank you very, very much indeed, and good night.